Galia in Tres Partes de Visa. First thing you need to know is that San Diego in 1970 was a very different place, not just because of all the building and the changing that's happened since, but because you got to remember what time it was. There were very few channels on TV, there were very few programs, there were very few movies put out compared to today. You couldn't get comic books at a comic book store because there weren't any. There's only like two people. Howard Rogofsky is the one I remember, who sold comics through the mail. Those of us who bought comics, we bought them in the 7-Elevens when we noticed they were in and when we had the money, because most of us weren't rich. This is a Navy town, an Air Force town, a working people town. So we got the comics when we saw them, when we could afford them. Those of us who wanted to collect them, most of the time we'd miss issues and never know it till the next issue came out. And you couldn't subscribe to it. You couldn't. So Richard Alf was starting to make a living from comics, I think, by that point. But most of us, I know my personal reason for getting into Comic-Con was just that so that I could actually go to a comic convention without going to some far-flung place I couldn't afford, like, say, Los Angeles. And there weren't any in Los Angeles anyway. The only ones I'd ever heard of were, like, New York and Chicago. There's no way on hell that we could afford to go to New York or Chicago for a comic book convention.
So how old are you in 1970 when the first con?
1970 was the year I graduated from high school. I was 18. My brother Steven was just about 19, about to turn 20 maybe, and my younger brother, he was a year and a half younger than I, Patrick, was 16 going on 17. I'd have to check the actual dates. So the people who came up with this crazy idea put an ad in the San Diego paper. I don't remember the wording, I don't have a copy of the ad, but my mother saw it. My father would never have bothered to notice, but my mother always encouraged us to read and to learn and to do things. She used to read us stories before we went to bed, most often Ricky Tikki Tavi. But so she saw this ad and she said, "You guys are all into comic books, so why don't you check this out?" So we did, all three of us. We took the city bus out to the, I think it was the clubhouse of a golf course where they were holding their first meeting. And most of the people weren't that much older than we were, but they were much better off. Richard Alf and I were basically the same age, but he was already out there making a living, and all I did was go to school and focus on grades. You know, I was in the chess club and the Latin club and the science club, but that's not the same as getting out there and starting your own business, now is it?
So you say that you went to the first meeting, and who's there? I mean, you mentioned
That's
Richard.
one of the things I can't help you with.
Okay.
I was very withdrawn. We were raised very badly. I was very withdrawn into myself. I'm sure I recognize a lot of names, but which ones were at which meeting and when I met them, I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
But we went to all the meetings, and mostly what we did is what you'd call gopher work these days. I distinctly remember getting the when they got the first program book printed. I remember them bringing it to the house and learning how to work a saddle stitch stapler and stapling all the books together. Right. So you find a bad staple on one of those books, that's my fault.
So these early ones these are the El Cortez ones, or?
Okay, the first one was held in March in one room of the El Cortez for one day. It was an experiment. We called it the Mini-Con. The plan was, gosh, okay, Shell knows Milt Caniff and some of these other people, and we've got all these letters back from people saying, "Gee, sorry we can't attend, but here's good luck to you, and here's a page you can put in your program book." So the question was, is anyone actually going to come to a comic book convention? Not a science fiction convention, mind you, but a comic book convention, in a town called San Diego, which most people haven't even heard of? It was a big question. We had no idea. So they got together with the El Cortez and they arranged one room for one day. That was everything. The dealer's room, any talks anybody wanted to have, one room. Day comes and it's elbow to elbow. Like Heinlein said in Starship Troopers, breathe in when your neighbor breathes out and get your elbow out of my eye. That's what kind of a place. But it meant people came. They came in big numbers. We had people selling comic books. We had people selling old comic strips. I mean, literally newspaper pages. We had people selling original art. And we had fans going, wow, who's that? I don't know. I never heard of him. Hell, I never heard of this comic book before. It was great. So then they got together afterwards and said, well, we made money and people came. Let's try it again. Okay, when? Well, how about November? That's 6 months away. We can throw together, if we work hard between now and 6 months from now, maybe we can go for 2 days. So come November, after a lot of work by everybody on the convention, basically the same people, they just rolled it over and kept on going. 2 days. Still in the El Cortez Hotel, but 2 days in several rooms. And it would still get your elbow out of my eye. But that meant we could only go from there, right?
Right.
So the first two conventions were, the Minicon and the first 2-day convention were held in the same year. But we weren't nailed down to any particular spot. The year after that, we went out to USD. I don't know how that came about. But in the meantime, somewhere in there, I graduated from high school, Hoover High, and I started as an astronomy major at San Diego State. I mention this because it's important to know that because of where it took me. I went out to San Diego State, and unknown to me, up in the Bay Area, a group called the Society for Creative Anachronism was about 3 years old. This is a group of people who would get out there and fight with more or less real armor. A lot of them made their own chainmail, more or less real shields, and weapons made out of rattan and hard rubber, which were designed to hurt like hell but do no actual damage. One of the people from the Bay Area named Jeff Rogers was a squire to one of the SCA's dukes, which is the title they give to someone who is king twice. I'll fill all the background into this later if you want, but we should keep this rolling. We'll do the background later. Anyway, so Jeff Rogers came down to take military history at San Diego State. He's sitting in his military history classes. We call it knitting chainmail. And the instructor gets annoyed and says, "What are you doing in my class?" "Oh, well, this is chainmail. This is how the knights of the Middle Ages made their armor," and blah, blah, blah. And the whole SCA spiel comes pouring forth. And before you know it, there is a new SCA group in San Diego, centered around Jeff Rogers and other San Diego State students, and mostly meeting at San Diego State. I went to State, and one day I'm walking between, this is relevant, I promise you. I was walking between Montezuma Center and the bookstore. At that time, San Diego State campus was it was just as big as it was now, but you'd have to subtract every other building that's out there now to picture State as it was then. There was these great big expanses of open lawn that now you can't find them because there's a building on top of them. The Love Library, what they called the old library then, was the new library. In fact, the construction fences were still in place. They hadn't torn them down yet. The library was in use, but the fences were still up. So I'm headed from lunch at Montezuma Center to check out something at the bookstore, which is directly south of it across a long green lawn. And here's these people in costume setting up a big white 2-peaked tent in the middle of this area, marking off a space with a rope and handing out flyers. And I get this flyer and it says, "Welcome to the current Middle Ages." And I said, "What the hell is this?" So I sat down. And they had this big, long, complicated demo. The Baron was there in his wheelchair because he'd broke his back as a teenager falling off a 60-foot cliff. And there were a bunch of fighters in different kinds of armor, including this guy in this really great Greek armor with this great big Greek shield with a serpent on it. And they fought each other, every possible combination. And at the end of it, I was hooked. Well, when we're having the meetings for the next Comic-Con, one of the things people mentioned was, we need some kind of security here. We had complaints of people just walking up to tables and grabbing things and walking away, and there was nobody to stop them. People were complaining that they were missing stuff. I said, hey, I know a bunch of really scary-looking people who have armor. They could stand around in swords. So for the first, I think it was the very first 2-day con, already we had SCA people in plate steel and chainmail standing there with helmets on their head holding swords. Believe me, you never saw such a well-behaved crowd in your life.
And that's one of the things that other people have mentioned as well, how inclusive the early cons were. I mean, very early on, they included Trekkers, and the SCA obviously was something that became very...
The Trekkers were an automatic. The Star Trek was about the only TV show there was that even began to be science fiction. In fact, if you look at them, a lot of the first season of Star Trek are actually people's science fiction stories that have been swiped and changed slightly. I distinctly remember one that was a Ray Bradbury story from the Martian Chronicles, and they just, instead of the planet swallowing up the evil developer and the guy who was protesting against the development being left as the only human on the planet, they just said, "Oh, well, that's too bad," and they sailed away in the Enterprise, which sort of took away the point of the story.
Well, the science fiction aspect of it, you had mentioned that was the kind of comics that you were drawn to, but you were also a science fiction fan. Like you
right, that's why I could recognize things like that. And Robert Heinlein, the only reason we have a blood drive at Comic-Con is because Robert Heinlein, many years later, as he got sicker and sicker, needed blood. So they started a blood drive to supply, if not the actual blood he needed, at least countervailing credit in his name. And this gets back to the SCA too, because right down the hall here you'll see the Robert Goodwin Handicap Services, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Robert Goodwin was the guy who started Handicap Services at Comic-Con. Well, Robert Goodwin was also in the SCA. Robert Godwin, a member of my household, and he got into Comic-Con because I was bringing the two of them together. Robert had been at the tail end of that generation who suffered from polio as a kid. Uh-huh. He was shorter than he needed to be, and on his bad days he could barely walk with a cane because he suffered from the after effects of polio. And when he saw things that would be obvious to us now, like the consideration for can people get around, are there enough ramps, are there people to help the handicapped people, he just took it upon himself to make that happen. And that's the kind of people who got involved in it.
So as you're getting more involved in this, are you finding that your SCA, you mentioned that was your sort of your social group?
That was probably my biggest contribution to Comic-Con, was the fact that I got into the SCA about the same time, and I got the Califians interested in Comic-Con and vice versa. It helped too that because the gamers, a lot of the early gamers, there weren't a lot back then. There's really just D&D, and it barely in existence. The D&D people tended to be one or the other, and this brought them together. A lot of the gaming stuff you have now is a direct outgrowth of the fact that the Scalians, the SCA members, would play role-playing games at tournaments if you didn't keep a firm foot on their neck telling them, hey, that's not period. But when they went over to Comic-Con, they brought it with them and built that up from nothing. The second 2-day con was at USD, and by that time the SCA was in full effect. We not only had SCA guards everywhere and SCA people telling people where to go, but we had running battles and fighting demos all over the place. I got knocked into a swimming pool when I was marshalling, and two of the fighters sort of lunged out of the field of play and knocked me into the swimming pool.
So early on, they're incorporating these science fiction luminaries. I mean, into George Clayton Johnson and Ray Bradbury's an early
Right.
Guest of honor. Was that something that you felt that your friend, it would bring more of your friends into the con, that you could be influencing people coming to the convention? Because your social group is getting larger.
I figured if, for myself, I was interested in having the comic book stuff taken care of. Science fiction was good if it showed up, but if it didn't, there were already science fiction conventions, whether they came to Comic-Con or not. There's already WorldCon and WesterCon. And we ended up having a third. Many years you'd have WorldCon and WesterCon would both be on this in California. That's happened like 3 or 4 times. And they also had all these science fiction writers show up at Comic-Con that could only help. Let me just mention, not to beat a point to the death, that a lot of the people who started the SCA were also science fiction writers. Poul Anderson, Marion Zimmer Bradley's brother, Edwin Zimmer, Randall Garrett. A lot of the early SCA people were, in fact, full-time professional science fiction writers, and that's why you got later science fiction writers like Catherine Kurtz, who lived in Los Angeles, and C.J. Sherry. It's a real question whether they knew about the SCA first or Comic-Con first. They definitely went to both. I don't think anybody could argue that it hurt the Comic-Con to have all these science fiction writers show up.
Right. Before we started rolling, actually, you and I were talking a little bit about your favorite comics, and those all lean towards science fiction as well,
Right,
like
right.
the comic book. So is that why you felt that it was already covered? The comics had that element of sci-fi to it, at least your favorites.
Some of them did. Should I bring them out?
You can if you'd like, yeah. I'd love to hear what you have to say about them.
This was probably my all-time favorite comic, Adam Strange appearing in Mystery in Space. This was a guy who was actually a scientist. He was an archaeologist, and he stumbled upon this ruin that he'd been looking for, and the natives didn't want the outside world knowing about, so they chased him off a cliff where he got hit by a Zeta beam from the planet Ran and instantly transported there. And this is very much an old pulp theme, really, in the light of John Carter Going to Mars or Barsoom, or a whole bunch of other characters in the old pulp magazines of the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. He was a true original if you look at him from the comic book side, but if you read the old science fiction, you know, he just another Earthman gone to another planet and become a hero, which I was fine with. More original was Magnus Robot Fighter. This takes place in the 40th century. Magnus was raised by a robot who foresaw that man would become completely dependent on robots, so he actually raised a human being to fight against robots. And the thing I like about both Adam Strange and Magnus Robot Fighter and the Legion of Superheroes, which is another favorite of mine, is these were full-fledged science fiction type worlds with their background to them. You read Adam Strange and you get a tour of the planet Ran that orbits Alpha Centauri A. They go to different places. You see this city and that city and the sea of such and such. You don't get a map or anything, but these places happen. Magnus lives in Northam, which basically covers all of North America in the year 4000, but he also has adventures off in space because they've got space colonies. And sometimes he fights not terrestrial robots, but extraterrestrial robots. Like they welcome, in one episode, they welcome an ambassador from Sirius with this clumsy servant Rob, which turns out to be a Trojan horse full of deadly little robots which are going to paralyze Northam by taking down all the utility centers. And of course, Legion of Superhero, all the superheroes came from different planets, and most of them, they were about half and half people who had accidents and gained superpowers, and half people who everybody on their world had that superpower.
So going to the conventions for you was a chance for you to find people with a commonality. Now you mentioned
Heck with people. I was looking for back issues, man. I spent all my time in the dealer room.
So you were a collector as well. Now that's something that has changed. In 1970, we didn't have the collector's culture that we have now. We didn't have Antiques Roadshow and where everybody seems to have a collection. So that was a...
People collected things, but there was no community to it. There were people even then who collected, say, science fiction magazines. There were so few science fiction magazines, even by 1970, that it was realistic to hope to get one copy of every science fiction magazine that had ever been published. The big problem there was not getting the magazines each month, it's getting the ones you missed maybe before you started collecting, because there were no stores selling them, there were no dealers, there was no Amazon, Yahoo, Google. You couldn't search for these things except by going to bookstores and magazine stores. They had magazine stores in those days, which have pretty much died out now. Going to the magazine stores, going through back bins, and hoping you'll find something that you never managed to find before. It's very much hit and miss.
Right.
It's the same way with comic books. You couldn't find comic books except by going through yard sales and things like that, and going to science fiction conventions and hoping somebody would happen to bring a copy of the one you missed. If not, like I said, there were only like 2 people selling comic books, and they didn't have that big a stock.
Right. So this was a way for people who did have those interests to find the particular thing that they were interested in.
Even at the very first con, the Minicon, the one-day one at the El Cortez, there were people up there displaying walls of comics I'd never even heard of. I mean, I was an 18-year-old kid. I had no knowledge of the history of comic books. There was no history of comic books and such. There were no books published about it. Well, there was one book. I had a copy of Jules Pfeiffer's The Great Comic Book Superheroes, and that was about the entire history of comic books as far as anybody knew, just like Sam Moskowitz's book. Can't remember the title, damn it. Check with me later and I'll dig it out for you. But Sam Moskowitz wrote a book which was basically a history of the early science fiction fandom, and that was all the history of science fiction there was. One book each.
Right.
So if you collected that stuff, great, and good luck to you, and you're going to need it.
So did you become aware of Richard Alf through his advertisements for his business, or
I had never seen the ad for his business. I met him at the Comic-Con committee meetings.
Okay, all right. So how do you become involved every year since then?
No.
Was there a period where you
after the convention at USD, I cut my ties basically with Comic-Con and dove headfirst into the SCA as a full-fledged my so-called life. The same way my brother Steven dove into D&D, and my brother Pat just dove, I guess. He never got wrapped up into anything the way we did, unless it was starting up in business or something. But I'll tell you exactly what happened. We have the USD con. The date arrives. Richard Alf and I have been doing, as near as I can tell, all the work getting ready for it. I was the registrar and the secretary and the guy who took in the mail when Richard brought it to me from the P.O. box and sorted through it and got everybody's memberships straightened out and took the deposit down to the bank, and Richard Alf, as near as I could tell, did everything else. But this will all change when the convention happens, right? Well, no. Come the actual convention, all these people who are on the committee are running around, going to the panels, going to the movies, hanging out in the dealer's room, but nobody's running the movies, nobody's watching over the panels, nobody's relieving the guards when their shifts are over. And frankly, I was a whole bunch pissed off. But we got through it, and we even planned to get an early jump on the next one, which would be, the following year. So we had a meeting at my place. Well, actually, my mom and dad's place. But so here's the three of us, the three McGlone brothers, and two guys I don't remember seeing before, but they swore up and down they were on the committee. Okay, so we start planning. What are we going to do next year? And one of these strangers said, "Well, we really ought to increase the what we charge for tables." I said, "Huh? $10 a table seems like an awful lot to me. If you increase what tables cost and you increase what it costs to get in the door, your fans aren't going to be able to attend." And this guy says, and this is a direct quote, "Fuck the fans." And I just sat there for about half a second, frozen in shock, because as far as I'm concerned, everybody on the committee was a fan. But I went with reply B, which was, once upon a time I had a science fiction magazine. My mom found the word damn in it and took it away from me. You just said, fuck. Get the hell out of my house. Don't come back. And everybody tries to say, oh, it's all right, he apologized. No, get out of my house. And that was the last I had to do with being on the Comic-Con committee.
Did you...
Even back then, if that kind of attitude was starting, I didn't need it.
Right.
I've been to a lot of Comic-Con conventions in the years when I happened to be living in San Diego.
Okay.
But that was the last time I was on the committee.
Right. Okay. So you when did you first go back? You remember? I mean, was it late 70s? Was there a long period of time where you had nothing to do with it, or?
It was pretty long. I was involved in the SCA in San Diego for a few more years while I went to state and got my degree. When I got my degree, you have to remember there was no such thing as computer science in 1974. I mean, there was, but the term hadn't been invented. In fact, my degree, I had a choice. If you were into computer hardware and you learned how to build and repair and maintain computer hardware, San Diego State offered you a bachelor's degree, a BS in, let me get this exactly right, and if I don't, I can look it up for you later, in applied math and science from the Department of Physics. If you're interested in programming, you could get a Bachelor of Arts in Applied Arts and Sciences from the Math Department. So I got my BA in what wasn't yet called computer science, and went looking for work, and got a job with Crocker Bank. I'd already been working as a computer operator at State on their IBM 360, showing new students how to run the key punch machines. We were right up to date, man. We not only had IBM 106 key punches, we had 109s, man. And I also had a part-time job with one of the professors in the physics department, when he set his future physics students a computer programmer, he was paying me to write the programs which he posted as the answer. So I went to work for Crocker Bank in Riverside. And now, why Riverside? This ties back to Comic-Con again. One of the fighters, one of the SCA fighters, at the USD convention was a guy named Forrest Lowe, who'd only just recently switched from being a wizard. When he first joined the SCA, he was wearing these big floppy wizard's costumes, and he'd appear in a puff of purple smoke after throwing some iodine trioxide crystals onto the spot where he wanted to appear from off site. Then he'd step into the middle of the cloud, and when it dissipated, there he was. But he had switched to being a fighter as a result of the peer pressure. Everybody in the barony was making mail, and he just could not resist. He was the roommate before me of David Sampson, who was another one of the original members of the group. David Sampson and I were sharing a trailer and going to state in a trailer park which is located where Alvarado Medical Center is now. So obviously, rooming with the one guy and seeing the other guy all the time, they're obviously going to come to Comic-Con as part of the fighting demos. One of the things we did was abductions. Usually the Baroness, because she was gorgeous and curvy and blonde, but we weren't above abducting other gorgeous curvy blondes either. They're getting set to have one of these abductions where a fighter grabs a blonde, throws her over his shoulder, goes running away, and all the other fighters go charging after him to rescue her. It was a big thing back then, and really attracted attention. What are those crazy people doing? Well, Forrest is getting ready to abduct somebody, and he sees a curvy blonde he's never seen before, holding some comic books, because he's a comic book fan who came there for Comic-Con. So he grabs her instead and runs and throws her over his shoulder and goes charging off. And they got married. Actually, I don't know if they ever did get married, but they were living together a year later. And they started the House Markheim, which I joined, and Robert Godwin joined, and other people joined who I don't think were as closely involved with Comic-Con. And Forrest got a job as a programmer up in Riverside, so he and Allison moved up there. And when I was looking, naturally, that was one of the places I was looking to, because I counted Forrest as like being like a brother to me. So I got a job with Crocker Bank in Riverside. Lived with them a couple of years. Went to a crown tourney up in the Bay Area with them. Met this girl who I instantly fell in love with and was married to for like 20 years. And so between, say, 1972 and 1992, the only time I came to Comic-Con was when Deborah and I took a vacation down here, and Comic-Con was a good time for us to come down. I think I came to 2 Comic-Cons in that time. In that time, Comic-Con almost died out, but it was rescued by another organization called STAR. I don't know if you've heard of STAR.
I haven't, no.
STAR was a group dedicated to bringing back Star Trek, which had gone off the air.
Okay.
I never got into it, but while I was off in Riverside, my brother Steven and my little sister Suzanne, who was only like 5 years old when Comic-Con started, had grown up to be like 15 or so they were into it. And they had this history, at least on Steven's part, of having been involved in Comic-Con, and on Suzanne's part of all 3 of her big brothers had been part of starting Comic-Con. Star was holding all sorts of weird events, including an outer space Model UN. I don't know if you heard about that.
I haven't.
The San Diego school system every year in their advanced students program, which they had back then. You had an actual separate track for the really smart kids, which included not only the aerospace seminar, which took place at the aerospace seminar on your during the summer between your 10th and 11th grade if you were selected for the program. I was in on that too. But they also had this Model UN where students from all over San Diego County chose what country they were going to represent, dressed up in the costume of that country, and attended the Model UN at San Diego State as delegates to the UN from that country. Now, I started the organization. I started the delegation from Chad. It included a couple of my included three of my buddies. Mark Horton, who was also in the SCA, Rick Robinson, and Suzanne Balvin, who all three of them had been in the aerospace seminar as well, and a couple of girls I knew from Hoover High School, and a couple other people, I'm not sure who, but at least those people. And we went out to San Diego State and spent the whole day divided into different committees, passing legislation and hoping there would be time in the General Assembly at the end of the thing to actually enact some of these bills that we passed in committee. This was a great lot of fun. Nothing really got done because either the, looking back on it, either the people involved were, despite their clothing, acting like Americans and passing everything that an American would agree with, whether it worked or not, or else they were taking their role so seriously they wouldn't allow anything to pass that their country they were representing would let pass in the real UN. So nothing much got done except we had a lot of fun and learned something about how the UN worked. So a few years later, STAR decides to have an outer space Model UN where people can come as delegates from various planets like RAN or I think the one year there was somebody from the fifth dimension dressed up as Mr. Mixius Pitalik. One year, my brother Steven and my sister Suzanne went as Jor-El and Lara representing the planet Krypton. So all this stuff ties together, you see. Comic-Con did not exist in a vacuum. Comic-Con was happening at the same time as the Avengers were playing on TV. Steed and Pew, not the Marvel Adventures. Right. At the same time as the hippies were inventing the SCA. The same time as San Diego schools were holding things like the Model UN and the Aerospace Seminar, and people were joining these different things, and they were crossing their memberships left, right, and sideways. STAR actually was really hitting its stride about the time that it looked like there wasn't going to be another Comic-Con, because all the people who started Comic-Con had either gotten into selling comics as a serious business, or they were burned out doing Comic-Con, or they had just up and left like I did. That year, one year, I don't know which, my brother Steven could tell you because he was there. STAR just basically took over Comic-Con. And for a number of years after that, the committee members for Comic-Con were all STAR people or ex-STAR people. So you guys need to talk to the STAR people. I'm sure when you get to talking to people from the later years, you'll find out. If you ask them, a lot of those people are STAR people.
Okay.
So,
all right.
All sorts of stuff going on here.
So do you think that it had a lot to do with the age of the committee members, that when they graduated college, they were pretty much, or when they went away to college, they were dispersed, and that's why you had that period where it looked like it could die out? Was it just sort of?
I don't know, because I wasn't here. I think it was partly that the people who started it were pretty much all of a certain age, with a few exceptions like Sheldorf, who were older. But most of us were around the same age, say 17 to 19, and a lot of them never intended to do it more than once or twice. That was fun. Okay, thanks. Some of them kept on doing it as long as they could do it, but they just plain got burned out. And some of them got turned off by the attitude that developed, that, the fuck the fans attitude. people who were coming in on the committee didn't have the same attitude, and they were running it from a very different viewpoint, and it didn't sit well with a lot of the old people.
So after '92, have you come back to Comic-Con? What do you think of the later years Comic-Con?
'92, I moved. I was remaindered from my job as a computer programmer with Tandem Computers, which was a big mainframe computer company. I spent the next 6 years in Oregon running a computer business. I was one of the last people supplying software that worked on the CPM operating system, if you know what that is. It's the original microcomputer operating system. Everybody was going to the PC, even though it was actually inferior technically to the 8-bit CPM computers. A few diehards like me were still selling the software and keeping it going. But you can only push water uphill for so long. And in '98, I moved back to San Diego looking for a full-time job. And I've been to most of the Comic-Con since then. And I have to tell you, it was a shock. Coming back to San Diego in '98, after not having lived here since '74, it was like moving to another planet, which I did later and taught English in Korea, but that's a whole other story. But the city had changed enormously. San Diego State had changed enormously. Comic-Con had changed enormously. If it weren't for the occasional recognizable thing sticking up out of the muck, you could hardly recognize the place. Did I mention already how San Diego State was barely recognizable?
Yeah, you did. But
Yeah.
When you come back, I mean, your family wasn't still here. Your parents weren't here. You didn't come back and visit in the meantime. It was just
My mother
20 years later,
died.
boom?
My mother died about the same time that Comic-Con started, and I got into the SCA.
Okay.
My father hung on, but he was, like my mother, he was a chain smoker. And in addition, he was no mincing words here, a flat-out drunk. One of the reasons the lot of us were raised so poorly is because he would spend half of his paycheck every payday in a bar, and then he'd spend most of the rest of it between there and the next paycheck. So, yeah, one of the reasons I came back was to see more of my dad before he finally passed away. He'd had a stroke like 15 years before from all the smoking and drinking, and didn't have much time left to him. But it was more, and part of it was to get the job. More of it was to see more of Dean Halford, the guy who was the founding Baron of Calafia. Like I said, Dean had been in a wheelchair basically most of his life, and he didn't have much time left, and I wanted to spend it to him. Robert Godwin was getting on in years, and I wanted to spend some more time with him. So yeah, that was part of it too. My first wife, did one of you say that you knew Armin Motes? Must have been somebody else.
It
Okay.
wasn't in this.
My first wife, Carolyn Illig, we were only married like 2-3 years, but her mom and I kept each other. Frances, Carolyn's mother, is getting on in years, and I wanted to see more of her before she passed on too. So, but I did go to Comic-Con. San Diego State is like wall-to-wall buildings now. The buildings I knew are still there, but every one of them has another one stuck, shoehorned in between. Same thing has happened with San Diego, the city. In 1970, you had downtown, a little bit of Hillcrest, I think, North Park, what they now call City Heights, but which was called East San Diego then. That was mostly the areas I wandered around in. You had Claremont and Kearny Mesa with a lot of empty space in between. You had La Jolla with lots and lots of empty coast in between. Tierra Santa, places like that, just flat out did not exist. They were empty spaces on the county map. I come back and San Diego County is wall-to-wall city. That was a shock. And people are saying, well, maybe you get a job in such and such. Huh? Where the heck is that? I never even heard of that name.
Right. So the first convention that you come back to is 98? Is that when you...
I think it was 98.
And by that time it's Comic-Con International.
Right. They had dropped, when we started it was San Diego Golden State Comic Convention. Sheldorf coined that name. And while I thought it was a bit over the top like Sheldorf himself, it was at least, recognizable. Nobody's not going to conflict with any other convention name, whether it's a comic book convention or a science fiction convention. That was on our first, certainly in all the conventions that I was in the committee with, that was what it said on the convention book. Came back and it's Comic-Con International, and I can believe it because this has grown from a convention for comic book weirdos that takes up a few rooms in the El Cortez or several rooms scattered around USD campus to something that fills the convention center, which didn't exist back then.
Right. So you come back and you're in the convention center. You're seeing a lot of the movies and these large displays, and this is what you think.
What the hell is that? There's an old Steve Martin routine that he did with John Belushi. It's 15 solid minutes of them peering at you out of the TV saying, "What is that? I don't know what it is. What the hell is that thing?" And on and on and on. "Oh, I know what that is. That's that's one of, oh, yeah. What is that thing?" In the time when I was away, this has grown into, I'm told, and I can believe it, the largest convention anywhere in the world. And we're talking about thousands of people. We're talking about 5 days worth of events, and it's jam-packed for every one of them, and you can't get a ticket unless you apply months in advance, and within a couple of years, the year before. And I'm thinking to myself, I remember when this was one room for 1 day in the El Cortez. Holy shit, what did I start?
Well, how did you get back in touch with this convention? I mean, were you in contact with Mike Towery or any of the people that started this? How did you find out about this? And
well, I would see some of the old timers every once in a while at a convention. I'd run into Scott Shaw or somebody, and they'd say, "Oh, it's one of the McGlone brothers. Which one are you?" Anyway, hi. Then the funny thing happened. My old buddies started dying off one by one. I'd read in the paper that this guy died or that guy passed away, and holy shit, Richard Alf is dead. Damn, I never even got to say goodbye. So then I get an email message from Mike Towery. Don't ask me how he got my email address, but I'm glad he did. And he says, Richard Alf died, and we're going to have a panel talking about what a great guy he was, and we would like to have you come to the panel. And to sweeten the deal for you, we'll let you come. We'll give you and a guest a full membership for all 4 days. Well, I couldn't refuse that. The year before I got in free, but that's because I was participating with a different medieval group, the Adrian Empire. I basically I got to go every day in return for working, sitting there for 3 hours a day playing recorder, a skill I had picked up in the SCA. But I wasn't going to do that because they didn't really keep my interest. But then I get this email offer from Mike Tower, and I say, "Hey, count me in. Richard Alf is a great guy." And so I used one of the tickets. My brother Stephen already had a ticket. I passed the other one on to my old friend Armin. So he spent the whole time in the magic tournament because he and my brother Stephen are. It's the only life they've got is Magic the Gathering. I'm not much better, but hey, at least mine's different. And come the time I'm going to the convention, I'm wearing my medieval costume just for the heck of it because I did most years. And little did I know Mike Towery was going to call me first. I wanted to see what everybody else had to say, so I kind of tailored my remarks to theirs, but he calls me first. And he starts out with a preface about how comic books collecting is respectable then, but back then we were all weirdos. And I took that as my cue, and when he called on me, I stood up in my red hoopalon with the angel sleeves and the belt with the pouch and the knife and the recorder on it, and I said, well, I have to differ with you there, Mike. Some of us are still weirdos. And I talked a little bit about how Richard and I worked together and how much more mature he seemed, even though he was the same age I was, and blah, blah, blah. And it went from there, and thank God my part's over. Yeah. But Mike also, I also heard at that same, no, the year before when I was with the Adrian Empire, I heard that Comic Fest was starting, and I went to the first Comic Fest. And I guess the thing with Richard Alf was last year. And then I got another email from, I guess from you guys, saying that you were going to do more of this and would I come and talk. So here I am talking your ear off.
You know, like you said when we started, we could fill up volumes with this, but I do want to do something that I've been doing at the end of some of these interviews, which is just sort of throw out a name and you just give us just the capsule, what you think of when you hear that name. And you've said a lot about Richard Alf, but could you just kind of encapsulate Richard Alf?
He was a great guy and he was a good friend. And if it wasn't for him, I think even with Shell Dorf, without Richard Alf, it wouldn't have happened, because there wouldn't have been. You would have had the contacts, but you wouldn't have had the logistics. Without Richard Alf supplying the background and ferrying people around in his car and putting up money, it wouldn't have happened. Certainly the second 2-year event, the one at USD. It wouldn't happen because he was doing almost everything.
And since you mentioned him, Sheldorf.
I have to confess, I never liked Sheldorf. He was a brash Easterner. He was a Chicago kind of guy, and you could tell he was a Chicago kind of guy, and he rubbed me all the wrong ways. And he admired Jack Kirby to death, and I can't stand Jack Kirby. I don't like his art. I don't like his characters. I can't stand what he did to the DC universe. But all that's personal, okay? Except for the DC universe part. But the fact that I did not like Sheldorf is personal, and I knew it was personal, and I worked around it, because there's no question if Sheldorf had not moved here from Chicago and brought his #1 fan status with him and all his contacts in comic books and comic strip industry, I told Wilbur and I told Orville, and I'm telling you now, it never would have gotten off the ground.
Okay, and you did mention Scott Shaw. You interact with him on the early committees, or?
Not really. There were a lot of people like that. They were doing their part. I was doing my part, which, especially on the first year, was mostly gopher work. I didn't have transportation. We didn't have a car. If they brought me work to do, like stapling or handing out flyers or whatever, I could do that. But I couldn't run around all over San Diego and help with things like that. The first year I was, in my senior year of high school, I was not only finishing up a very heavy school load, I took lots of science courses. I took all the science courses and all the math courses that the San Diego school system's advanced program would offer. In fact, in the senior year, we had a city college instructor coming by our class and teaching us first year calculus, and we had another instructor teaching us first year college physics. That's how good the San Diego schools were back then. I was doing all that, plus all the science classes, all the math classes I could, plus I was heavily into Latin. I took 3 years of Latin in San Diego school, and then the fourth year they kicked our resident Latin teacher upstairs to some college somewhere, so I had to tackle, I wasn't about to give up, so I had to tackle the Aeneid on my own. And if you don't think wading through 11 volumes of epic Latin poetry isn't a tough road to hoe, I'll tell you, you're wrong. So I was too busy to do anything extracurricular, unless, you know, if it was there, if it was at a set time, I would do it. But these odd meetings here and there with Scott Shaw or any of these people, they brought me a task to do, I could do it, but
I see.
heck, I wasn't even going out for wrestling anymore. In the previous year, I'd gone out for varsity wrestling. Won most of my matches just by showing up because I only weighed 110 pounds. And a lot of times, there was nobody on the other team who weighed the same as I did, so I won just by showing up. That stayed the same until I was like 35, and then my metabolism turned down a notch and I gained some weight. But anyway.
Well, then, since your brother is in here, let's just wrap up with him. Stephen, what was his role early on? I mean, obviously...
Pretty much the same as mine. Stephen and Patrick were the other main gophers. After starting with the... nowadays, and I think for some time in the past, if you sign up as a gopher and work for 3 hours, you get the rest of that day free, if I understand that. Stephen and Patrick were doing that before there was such a role, just because that was the only way they could really contribute. They were right next to me, stapling the same as I was, and taking piles and putting them in boxes and all that sort of stuff. Starting the USD, starting the second year, we were joined by a couple of other permanent full-time gophers, Pam May and Donna Gary. So we had 5 gophers, 3 male, 2 female.
All right. Well, I think we got it. I know we've got a couple of other things that we need to do, but like you said, we could fill up volumes with this.
Yeah.
But